All right. Welcome everyone to the last office hours, Storybook office hours this year. We have a cool guest in the office hours. It's Varun, and Varun works for Chromatic. And he today will show us everything we need to know about Chromatic. But before I start with your presentation, I also found out that you have a blog, varun.ca, with very cool topics about 3D mathematics and design systems. So feel free to visit his blog as well, varun.ca. And today's topic is pretty interesting to me because it deals with one major issue in UI development. It's about seeing breaking changes between two versions. And normally, if you have unit tests or even if you have end-to-end tests, you sometimes miss them. You can break things without knowing, and shifting pixels around. And for years, you have bugs that appeared, and you don't know that they existed and where they're coming from. So I'm super excited to hear more about Chromatic and hand over to you, Varun. How are you?
Not too bad. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Cool. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there with a lot of the bugs that are visual. It's most of the testing tools aren't really built for that. There's sort of a old school visual regression testing, which would take snapshots of the entire page, and that was one way to catch it. But with that, you still don't really know like where exactly is the bug or what exactly changed. And then there's the sort of the snapshot testing bit that came out of the React community, where you take a snapshot of the DOM, and that way you can see if the DOM for the component changed. So with Chromatic, we kind of combine the two together, where you're doing visual snapshotting, but at the component level. So I'll walk through sort of a quick example of what that looks like. Let me just share my screen. All right, can you see a storybook running here?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So I just have a little storybook. It's essentially just a task list that lets you um, do sort of the usual task list stuff. So you can delete stuff, you can edit the task list, and if you pin something, it moves to the top. So the way we recommend sort of you set this up in Storybook is you will have stories for each level of component. So at the very sort of lowest level is sort of the task component, and this task component does not manage any state internally. Everything is just data coming into it, and action handlers are coming into it. So I have a story for each state of this component. So the default state, pin state, when it's archived, and then another sort of testing scenario where what happens if the task that the user provided is really long. Does it get handled correctly or not? And then as we sort of go up, there are stories for the task list, which is just a list of these tasks altogether, which also has states like a loading state and an empty state, and then all the way up to the inbox screen for your task application. And this is the point where it's like a full page that manages state and everything. And again, it has an error state, and then there's also a secondary screen for login. So that's kind of the setup of the application. This demo app was built in React, but again, like that part doesn't matter. As long as you put something into Storybook, you can run that in Chromatic. So I'll sort of walk through what it looks like to set this up on Chromatic. So once you log into Chromatic, usually you would use some kind of Git provider, because the idea is you want to connect your project to your actual GitHub repository or Bitbucket repository or GitLab, whichever one you might be using. So in my case, I'm logged in with my GitHub repository. So if I go to add a project, I can choose the repo. In this case, it's called the UI testing guide code. So I'll add that in. And then you have to do sort of the first run in Chromatic. So the idea of visual regression is you're comparing two things. So you need sort of that first thing to compare against. So to do that, you run this command npx chromatic with the project token. And that's pretty much all you have to do to run Chromatic. As long as you're using Storybook, you have stories for your components, Chromatic will take snapshots of every single story that's in your Storybook. So I'm going to switch over to my terminal and run this command. And by the way, please feel free to interrupt and ask questions at any time. It takes a couple of minutes, and what's happening now is there is a Chromatic CLI that's actually building your storybook locally. So this is the static build of your storybook. Once that build is complete, that is uploaded to Chromatic, and then Chromatic spins up a bunch of cloud browsers to run each story one at a time and then take a snapshot of it. And by default, it does that in Chrome, but you can also sort of configure to run the same story across Chrome, Firefox, and IE. And I believe we're going to be supporting Safari sometime in the early next year.
And how does it know what storybook to build if you run this command?
So you have to run the command within the project itself. So it checks for two things. One, that you're running in sort of like a valid Git project, because Chromatic relies on Git history to figure out which commit to associate a snapshot to. And then secondly, the Chromatic CLI sort of parses your package.json to see if there is a build storybook task in there, and then it tries to run with that. And some of that stuff you can configure if you sort of run Storybook in a monorepo. You can tell it that you're running from a subdirectory within the project, or if you have a custom Storybook command, you can tell it what that command is, so things like that. So generally, we have a lot of heuristics in there just to figure out what kind of storybook this is. Like, is it a React storybook? Is it Angular storybook? And based on that, run the correct build.
Sounds good.
But if you have like a separate build command for your monorepo in which you want to run it for you want to run it for all the libraries, but you want Chromatic to run only on one library, where would you put that config? Would that be in package.json or somewhere else?
Yeah. So let me switch over to the docs. So there is a CLI page for the docs, and there's like a few different options. So one is build script name. So when you run npx chromatic, you can pass in what exactly is the command that you want to execute. You can also pre-build your storybook and then just pass that into Chromatic itself. So instead of getting Chromatic to build it, that's another option. And then if you're running in a monorepo,
what do you mean by pre-build?
So in this case, when I run npx chromatic, it's a two-step process. It literally runs yarn build storybook under the hood, and then takes the output of that and then uploads that. So if in your CI process you're already doing that and you don't want to do that a second time, you can run yarn build storybook, and then when you run chromatic, by using the storybook build directory flag, you can just tell it that, hey, this directory already has a pre-built storybook. Just use that instead of rebuilding it. So that's sort of another option.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
And then lastly, there's also sort of like a base directory flag that you can provide, which tells Chromatic which directory it will find Storybook in. So if you're running it from the top level, it will try to go into that sub project where you have within your monorepo, wherever you have Chromatic, to run Chromatic in there. Cool. So the build sort of passed, and you get an update now in the Chromatic's UI. It shows you the number of components it found and the number of stories and sort of which commit it's associated to on which branch and so on. So at this point, we're sort of like, we have our baselines. This is what everything is going to be compared to going forward. So
when the build passed, what did you do to get to this view?
It just automatically updates the screen. So
opens it in the browser.
Yeah, you can sort of the CLI will give you a URL too that you can click to get to this page. But if you just have the browser page open, it also automatically updates to reflect the new state of the UI. So this is kind of where you're at. Like, you don't have anything.
And the link is the URL different every time you run Chromatic?
It will be. So this is sort of like the setup stage. So once I'm past the setup, then the process will kind of be similar. So let me jump to that. So essentially, what this is recommending is like make a change to the UI, and then you can sort of do comparison. So I'll just jump into my code and open up the task component, and let's change the font size to, I believe large is one of the options. Just make sure this is working. Yeah, so the text is a little bit bigger. Let's make it even bigger just to, we can see those changes. All right, so I'll switch back into my terminal, make another commit. And then run Chromatic again. So right now I'm running everything locally, but usually you would just set up your CI provider to, every time you push, to run Chromatic automatically. So I'll show you how to do that part too, just starting here.
One question that came to my mind was when you run this in the CI, and what state should it return if you have a diff? Is it a warning? Is it an error, or should you do you need to deal with it and then the pipeline reruns and it's green, or?
Yeah, so usually you don't have to configure that yourself. So for example, if you're using any of these providers, Chromatic will automatically provide PR badges to you.
Oh.
So by default, it's sort of an orange badge, and when you approve accept changes, then it will turn to green automatically, or if you reject changes, then it will turn to red. Because the idea is someone has to sort of look at the changes and decide, were these acceptable changes or not? So we're kind of at that stage now. So in the CLI output, it says, hey, we've found 7 visual changes. You should take a look at them and decide whether that's exactly what you want to do or not. So this is sort of one example of what that build page looks like. So each build is associated with a particular commit, and it captures all of the snapshots of every single story in your storybook. But the only things that you have to review are snapshots that have changed. So this is quite similar to reviewing code kind of idea. So let's go ahead and review changes. So actually, let me start at the task component. So you can see you can switch between sort of like a 1-up or a 2-up diff, depending on whatever makes it easier for you to spot changes. There's like a few other things you can focus, so it will highlight the part that actually changed. There's also sort of that green pixel that you can see that kind of shows you what exactly changed. That you see both the new snapshot and the diff snapshot sort of overlaid on top of each other. So there's a few different things just to make it easier to figure out sort of what changed. So in this case, if I sort of go into the 1-up thing, you can see that you can turn on the strobe mode, and you can see that, okay, clearly something has changed. There's sort of bigger text and so on. That tells you sort of what changed, and you can decide, yeah, that's actually a thing that I wanted to do, so I'm going to go ahead and accept it. And then as you go through the rest of the task, you'll notice that it's kind of the same change, that the text size has increased. And then the cool thing is, like, because these components are used in higher level components, so when you change the task component, that will also trigger changes at the task list component. So Kai had a really good example of, you changed padding and suddenly the password component breaks because the eye icon is misaligned. So stuff like that will be caught here, because if you make changes in one component and that triggers a change in visual change in another component somewhere else, because of visual diff, you're running it against everything in your storybook, you can catch those changes fairly easily. So in this case, I'm kind of happy with these changes. So if I go ahead and accept this, and then I missed this one, task list. So again, going at to the very top level, which is the page level component, also has those changes. So again, accept it. Now the entire build is accepted. So once you accept these changes, what happens is Chromatic will update the baseline. So these new images are now the baseline. So if you make another change and push your code, or a teammate of yours makes a change and pushes code, this is what will be the snapshot that everything is being compared against. Any questions here?
Maybe some maybe question about size, not particular to this situation, but is there any reprecise limit? Because if you add custom fonts, images, and stuff like that, your Storybook tends to like get very big. And does this impact any besides the local build in your CI, any performance on Chromatic, or are there limits?
No limits at all. So I'll give you an example. Chromatic is built using Chromatic itself. So we have a Storybook that has something like 2,000 stories in it, or yeah, I think something like that. And there's no problem running it. So the reason for that is each story runs in an iframe, right? So when Chromatic is doing a snapshot, it's actually opening up the iframe to capture the snapshot. And it's running all of these snapshots in parallel. So if you have hundreds of components, thousands of stories, it will spin up multiple browser instances to capture them in parallel. So even for sort of the larger storybooks, the build time tends to be just a few minutes. So in this case, you can see it only took 10 seconds to actually capture the stories. So it tends to be fairly performant, and that's sort of one of the benefits, right? There are other sort of tools you can use to do visual diffing, but then you have to figure out how do I run this in my CI pipeline? How do I spin up multiple browsers in parallel? So that's the part that we're doing for you. We're sort of figuring out how to optimize that build and snapshot process.
Sounds amazing.
Cool. So this is kind of like the basics of Storybook. Oh, sorry, Storybook and Chromatic sort of together. And then I believe last time Kai was saying that you all got introduced to interactive stories, which is sort of a new feature that landed in Storybook 6.4. So what you can do now is you can write, you can use testing library to write interactions right within Storybook itself. And let me show you an example of that. So I mentioned earlier, when you are working with this task list component, you can sort of interact with it and modify and do all kinds of modifications to the task items. So usually when you would test this, the way you would do it is you would write a just test or like Angular component level test. You import the component into your test file and then write out the interactions for sort of triggering all of these changes. And then you compare the DOM to see did the DOM update correctly or not. So that idea works really well. And what we're doing now with interactive stories is allowing you to bring that right into Storybook itself. So here I have an example of that. So in this case, I wrote a bunch of interactions that actually fire all of those things you can do in the task list and lets you control them, lets you sort of like automatically run them. So you don't have to do that manually over and over again. So it runs really quickly, but essentially it is going through and doing all of the things like updating the state to pin state, modifying an item, marking something as checked, editing a task, deleting a task, all of those things. When you run this test in Jest, you kind of have to do the assertions yourself. And with interactive stories, you're still going to be able to write those assertions in the test right away. So that's coming early 2022. But on top of that, what you can do is you can run these interactions and then run a snapshot test on top of that. So let's go ahead and add that in. So I've enabled this story now, and I won't worry too much about sort of the syntax bit, but the only important bit here is that the interaction is written as a play function on the story, and it is an asynchronous function, and that's the important bit. That's how Chromatic knows to wait for all of this stuff to complete before it's going to take a snapshot. And most of these operations that come from testing library are asynchronous, so you just use the sort of classic async await paradigm to write out your interactions. And then now let's add in another commit. And run Chromatic once more. Oh, and while it's building, another sort of cool thing is every time you run a build, you get Storybook deployed for that specific build. So through the libraries tab, you can click on View Storybook, and it will take you to the Storybook for that particular build. So if something happened in your Storybook and you're not sure sort of when that change crept in, you can go through previous builds of your Storybook and actually do a comparison. So you always have sort of a link back to every single deployment of Storybook that you've done. And if you just want to get the latest version on a particular branch, you can also grab sort of create links. So in this case, it's just the branch name, -- and then this is your project ID. So if I wanted to get the latest Storybook for the main branch, it would just be main -- and then this will automatically go to tell Chromatic, go find the latest commit on the main branch and to take me to the Storybook for that branch. So if you want to share sort of like one version with your team, you can use sort of this link generation thing. But if you sort of want to go back and look at other Storybooks, you can just use the library page.
How far long does it save the history of builds?
I believe we keep them forever. I haven't come across the idea that we're deleting any of those builds yet. All right, so switch back to the build. The build is complete. This time it found one visual change, so let's go check it out. So the only visual change is a new story that we added. So in this case, this story did not exist previously, so there is nothing to compare against previously, but you can see that the snapshot was captured after all of those interactions were executed. So we know that this is good. And I'm going to go ahead and accept it. And now, if for some reason there is an error in any of these operations, the final result will mean that the snapshot looks different. So you can catch those changes, just like your sort of like logic issues, just by looking at sort of visual comparisons.
So it compares the final result, not each test itself, but the final result of your play function.
Exactly, for now. And then next year, we're sort of experimenting other ways that we could work with Chromatic. So there might be potential that where we snapshot every step of the interaction test. So we are sort of working on that. We haven't sort of landed on what the ideal approach is. So for the time being, it will capture the snapshot at the end of the whole thing.
Which is good enough, I think, for now, because you can see if you all your tests do the same end into the same result. So sounds pretty good.
Totally. All right, so that's kind of the basics of snapshot testing. I will quickly show sort of the GitHub workflow bit. So the execution of Chromatic is relatively straightforward. You pretty much just have to run npx Chromatic to get it going. But that said, you can still sort of like automate that whole process through GitHub Actions. So depending on your CI provider, in our docs, we sort of have examples for most of the popular ones. My repository is on GitHub, so I will just simply grab this one. Oh, actually, so this is from another project that I pulled, but I will just simplify it just to have the Chromatic bit. So two things here. One, Chromatic relies on your GitHub token because it's sending updates back to the PR screen. So that badging idea. So this is automatically in your GitHub CI setup, GitHub Actions setup. So it will come from environment. You don't need to configure it. The only thing you do need to configure is your Chromatic project token, which again, it's a good idea to just put it in your CI environment. So I'm going to go to the repo first and configure that bit. Secrets, sorry, that's where I need to go. So the secret name is Chromatic project token, and the token value, again, you can get from the manage tab, which is this token. So usually it's a good idea to keep this in as an environment variable and not put it in your Git repository. But if you do sort of mess up and leak it somewhere, you can always just click reset token to generate a new token. Right, cool. And then what's happening here is we publish a chromatic action, which is what this particular workflow is using, which behind the scenes, it's mostly just running the npx chromatic command and building Storybook for you. It just exposes all of the CLI options as options for the action itself. And again, the docs for that are available as part of the CLI, or even on action itself is open source. The Chromatic CLI is also open source, so you can always sort of go and see how that code was written. And the README for the action sort of covers a few examples. So this is sort of the monorepo example where your Storybook is inside the front end package, let's say. So you're just telling Chromatic to run within that package. So that was Ankita's question previously. So this is another example of sort of how you can configure that part. So I have this set up. I'm just going to commit this and push it. I'm going to push my code, and if I did everything correctly, it should be running, and it looks like it is running that command. So this is the same thing that we were doing locally, just running npx chromatic. You can see the build output. So step one is just checking out your repository in the actions environment. Step two, install the dependencies, and then build and publish Storybook. So while that's running, any other questions that you all have?
You previously showed that you can open storybooks from Chromatic, but how would you deal with that if you are a company that wants to keep things private and maybe only wants to have a storybook for their use but not a public use?
Totally. So two things. One, Chromatic, when you link it to a GitHub repository, it automatically mirrors permissions based on that GitHub repository. So anyone who has read access to the Git repository will have read access to your Chromatic project. Anyone who has edit access will be able to publish new snapshots to your, or create new builds for your Chromatic project. And if that repository is private, then your Storybook is also private. So you would have to authenticate via GitHub to be able to view that repository, or Bitbucket or GitLab, whichever.
Okay, I understand.
However, a very common scenario is teams have a private repository for their data, but they still want like Storybook. So in that case, we do allow you to change the visibility. So if it's an open source project, then everything will be visible by default. But if it's a private project, then you can still choose to just share the Storybook, but hide all the code behind the scenes. And then the other thing is during this sort of process, you're often sort of working with designers, product managers, and other stakeholders that you might want to include in the UI review process. And you can always invite those other folks using email and sort of control sort of how much access that they might have to your project, whether they can view it or review pull requests and things like that.
Okay, this is a really important feature I haven't thought of, including designers as part of your reviewing process.
Totally. So that's what I want to show next. So the CI build is complete. I did not make any changes to any components or any stories. So in the job, you'll notice that it did not find any kind of changes. No visual changes were found to this build. If I go into my Chromatic project, the build did run on that commit, but 0 changes were found. So that's where we're at now. And what I want to show next is sort of the PR review process, which sort of uses Chromatic to connect the designers and developers together and sort of put the whole thing into PR badging and show sort of how that works. So to get started, we have everything connected to GitHub already. So just want to install the Chromatic application on GitHub, and this is what will enable the PR badging and the UI review process. So I have the right repository selected here, going to improve the install, and sorry, the wrong password there. Cool. So we have that installed now. So what I'm going to do now is create a new branch. Let's call it, I don't know, visual changes of some kind. And let's add in some changes. So I believe I'm using some kind of theme setup here. So this is going to look weird, but there you go. Okay, for some reason, the developer decided to switch colors to this red from the teal for some reason. Let's go with that. Let's add that change in. And push that to GitHub. And then let's go ahead and create a pull request. So what's happening with this pull request is behind. Oh, sorry. I realize I'm linked to the wrong origin here. So let me switch that. Which is strange. I thought I cloned the right repository here, but I guess not. Oh, weird. I think that's just the GitHub command showed me the wrong URL for some reason. Yeah, that's what happened there. That's weird. Okay, let's open up a new pull request. So visual changes was the branch that I pushed to. See, the only change was the red color. So let's go ahead and create that pull request. And you can see that the Chromatic action was fired. So this is going to run behind the scenes. And then once that build is complete, then it will kick off sort of the UI review process that I mentioned. And you will also get badges for the Storybook deployment and any visual tests that were executed during the part of this build. So again, while that's running, happy to answer any questions that you might have.
A bit of
Yeah.
Okay, let's start.
I was just asking that this would only run on the difference that it detected. It won't run on the entire story build. No, wait, it'll run on the entire build, right? I think it'll run on the entire build.
So really good question. So by default, Chromatic runs on the entire Storybook because what happens is like a CSS file could change that impacts global styles, and then suddenly you have changes that appear in components, and that CSS file might not be a dependency for your component. So there's like weird stuff like that that happens with visual testing. So by default, we run it on the entire Storybook. However, if you want to change that, we recently launched this new feature called TurboSnap, and what this uses under the hood is Webpack stats to figure out the dependency tree for your components and your stories. And in this case, it will check to see whether the dependency of a story has updated, and if it does, it only then snapshots it. So that's another option. And again, there's like certain scenarios when it's unable to tell whether a dependency changed, or you update a package, or you update a global CSS or something like that. In those scenarios, it will not rely on the dependency changes and run tests for the entire thing.
Could you show us like how does it? Oh, it's just Webpack's dependency graph. So it's
Yeah, exactly. It's under the hood, like it's just running build Storybook with Webpack stats JSON, and then that stat JSON file is what we parse to figure out what dependencies changed.
okay. I don't know about this.
It's a new thing. It's somewhat experimental, and like as more people use it, we get sort of a better idea. So that it is there if you want to try that out. Any other questions?
I think.
Sorry. You just set it up in package.json. Is that how you set it up? The TurboSnap thingy.
Oh yeah. So essentially, the way you do it is you run Chromatic with the only changed flag, and that's kind of all you have to do. If you're on an older version of Storybook, or if you're using the pre-built Storybook, or on an older version of Storybook, then you have to update your build Storybook command too. But if you're using 6.3 plus or 6.2 plus even, and you're not doing a pre-built Storybook, then just simply add this flag, and that's all you have to do.
So so suppose you add a new Storybook that doesn't have a baseline.
Mm-hmm. In that case, it will
suppose you add like a new Storybook story. So I think in that case, this is super helpful and fast because it doesn't need to be run on all the other new stories.
Totally, yeah.
Okay, that's awesome.
Okay, cool. So yeah.
Oh,
sorry,
okay. Do you want to proceed? I just wanted to add something to this.
Yeah. No, go for it.
I was wondering if this is even a good idea not to run everything, because it's pretty common, and if you're in Angular, it's a pretty common mistake to you normally write styles for your component scope, but you are able to break out of your component scope and kind of make it global scope. It is global scope, but you can even scope that down so it's only global from the level of your component to all your children. But a pretty common mistake is that you forget to actually correctly scope it and override global styles, which ends up in changes in other components. And if you don't test them, I don't see how this can benefit you to only run stories that have changes.
Yeah, exactly. That is the issue. Visual changes rely on CSS, and it's really hard to figure out to scope that CSS to just that component. Like you can have styles being injected all over the place that change it, and that's why the default behavior is to just run it on the entire Storybook.
Yeah, I do not know how Webpack figures out its dependency graph. So
I mean, essentially, it's just tracking imports, right? But like I said, like you could have CSS in a separate component that has nothing to do with your component, and you can scope styles to your other component, right? And there's no way for Webpack to find that out.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on to sort of the review process. So this is the badging that I mentioned, and Kai sort of asked about like what status does it get, and this is the orange status you get by default, which means it requires you to go take a look at it. So there's one for Storybook publishing, so this will just automatically take you to the specific commits published version of Storybook, and a lot of teams just rely on that to do visual reviews, even if you don't have tests enabled. And it's just sort of handy to just have that one click right there to take you to the deployment of the Storybook. And then there's two things here: UI tests and UI reviews. So UI tests is same stuff that we saw previously. So if I start reviewing changes, you'll notice that it finds the green stuff that's highlighted. That's the red color that was introduced. So you can sort of go through here and accept or reject these changes. So if I just sort of go through and accept all of these changes, and switch back to my GitHub PR, you'll notice that this is now marked as checked. And then UI review is sort of the other place where this is where you can bring in designers and get them to sort of actually review the components you've coded and see whether this is the change that you want or not. So in this case, sort of it's tied to that particular pull request. So merging the visual changes branch into the main branch. So if I click on view on GitHub, it takes me to that pull request page. Whereas the UI tests are running commit to commit on that same branch. And we have a really good sort of visualization of that in our documentation. So let's say this top branch is the main branch, and this is the features that you're working on. So when you push the Z commit is compared against the Y commit. It's just sort of tracking Git history. The changes on the Y commit will be compared against B, and so on. So when you run those visual chromatic builds, it's just sort of going back in Git history to compare against baselines along that branch. But when you open up a pull request, it's then comparing changes on this branch, the latest commit on this branch, to the latest commit on the branch you're merging into. So that's where it's slightly different. And sometimes the changes are slightly different too, because you might have sort of some changes merged into the main branch since this branch was being worked on. So there might be other visual differences here that are maybe not caught on the branch that you're working on. So the C and D part changes, those are not in the Git history for this feature branch. So that's not going to be there when you run the UI tests. But when you go to open up the PR, that's when those changes are caught. So it's because it's mirroring the Git history, I find it works much better than where you just have sort of one canonical branches or snapshots for each branch. That way, if multiple people are working on a feature on different branches, it's really kind of hard to track what is the actual change between my branch and the stuff that's in main, for example. Does that any questions about that?
Actually, yes. I was wondering, would you say you should only do one of both options? You clicked through all the changes in another view, but now we are in the pull request view, and I thought, isn't it the only view you might need if you really heavily rely on pull requests against your main branch, and you always want to only see the difference between main and your feature branch, and want to go through that with other people?
No, actually, we recommend sort of doing both. So on your own branch, you could be running visual tests that just sort of tracks work that you're doing, and then once you're ready to merge in, that change set is quite important. If you were just relying on pull request views, then those baselines aren't updated because of the UI, the way Chromatic works. So it actually, you kind of need to do both for the ideal workflow, so that UI tests will just run these sort of individual snapshots on each commit, and PR review will run a comparison against the two branches. So yeah, you totally have to do both, I would say.
Okay.
So again, kind of the same idea with PR review. You can also sort of provide qualitative feedback on why is this red kind of thing, and this is where designers can come in and they can provide feedback, and you'll notice that all those conversations sort of open up as like a checklist that you can work through and say, okay, I've made that change. I'm happy with where that is. And if you're happy with everything, the person who is assigned to the PR, they can approve or reject. So again, if I approve this, go back to GitHub, all things are now green and everything's checked, so you're good to merge in.
It's an amazing workflow.
And then, yeah, and then lastly, like once you merge it in, just to sort of wrap the whole thing up, another build will fire, which will update the baselines for main. So usually there's not going to be any changes there, but once you hit merge, it will just fire up another build just to update the baselines for the main branch too.
Great.
Cool. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, we have 5 more minutes. Do we have any questions? I actually have one. You have tons of git alias commands. Is this some sort of kind of, you install a package and you all get the GCA, GA and stuff like that? I've never seen them before.
Oh, I use OMIZ shell as my shell, and then it has a git alias package that has all of that stuff.
Okay, I'm a poor Windows user, so I most likely cannot use OMIZ. How's it called? I've also got the name. CSAH.
Yeah, I think you should be with the new, because Windows supports that, right? The Bash terminals now, right? So you should be able to install it.
Yeah, maybe? with Windows subsystem Linux, you might be able to use it actually.
So there's a question about Chromatic Storybook. It is not public, but I can try and show it.
We don't want you to get into any trouble, Varun. It's fine. I was just very curious to see it.
Yeah, I can show it. There's no, it's the UI you're using if you use Chromatic, so nothing hidden there. Let me just grab it though.
I have a very basic question, but you can't use Chromatic if you're not using Storybook, right?
That is correct. Yes, it is definitely built around Storybook.
And you can, even though Chromatic will run on your visual tests, your interactive tests, it's still at the end of the day testing them visually.
Yeah, exactly. It's but once Storybook supports the assertions in interaction tests, then we will also surface those assertions in Chromatic itself. So if a particular assertion fails, we will also report which assertion failed in Chromatic. Right, so this is Chromatic's Storybook. You can see a lot of stories. We also use composition. So the Storybook design system is one of the dependencies for this UI. So we compose that into the Storybook. And like I said, we have entire screens in our Storybook. So this is an example of that, where the entire build screen is here. The settings page is entirely built here. So if the avatar component breaks for some reason, we're able to sort of find those changes and see like how many pages are going to break because of that, or if you change padding somewhere, how much of the application is going to break because of that.
And by the way, if you don't know the composition feature, it's basically you can build a storybook that links lots of other storybooks, and you have one like giant storybook with sub storybooks in it. And it's pretty cool, I must say.
Yeah, and it relies on publishing the storybook. So again, like if you're using even if you just want to publish your storybook, Chromatic has a free tier that will do that. So you can use that and then use that as a way to compose storybooks together.
All right, so we have 1 more minute left, and I'm going to use it to say thank you, Varun. It was an exciting presentation about Chromatic. I knew a few things here and there, but never have actually used it before. And it's a very important topic, and I think having Storybook and Chromatic covering visual regression testing is pretty great, and helps UI developers to solve those issues. And with that said, I would like at least those who are here to say thank you, and maybe turn on your camera if you want, and say.
I'll turn it off if you all don't judge me, because I'm just sitting in the sun. It's my day off today, and I'm just inside.
We'll be jealous if you're sitting in the sun.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
That's a nice view.
Outside, yeah. I'm just sitting outside. I don't want to make people jealous, but yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Varun. It was so helpful, because this is exactly why I'm using the Chromatic. It's been so helpful to get designers' opinion on all the visual changes that we're making as part of our design system. So glad to see that. Are you on Angular Nation / where can I reach out to you with more questions?
I don't think I'm an Angular Nation, but I will.
You should be.
Yeah,
we can fix that.
It's
free. Storybook channel.
Yeah, I should join. I have a big history with Angular. I used to work at Wrangle.io, which is like a consultancy, definitely big in the Angular space, like way back. I started like when the company was like 5, so worked with Angular for a long time. But I'll drop my Twitter handle here, and then also I'm on the Storybook Discord. So either of those places you can find me, and happy to chat. And then yeah, I'll join Angular Nation after this too.
Hopefully we'll see you again. This was really a cool conversation, and great questions, Ankita. Yeah, and we've discovered quickly, and Angular Nation is new, but we discovered very quickly the conversation starts with Angular, but it does not end with Angular, because there's so much overlap with all of the whole ecosystem that we're having all kinds of conversations. So we would love to have you.
Yeah, totally. Looking forward to it.
And I have to say this is what I was thinking the whole time when I was watching this presentation. Where were you when I was a team lead? Because I needed this. I would have loved to have this when I was a team lead years ago. And this would have been so perfect for me. So I'm sure there are a lot of team leads out there going, yeah, that would make my life easier. I can just skim over everything quickly. It's really cool. So thank you very much. And obviously, as always, thank you, Kai, for bringing these cool guests. So much fun.
Thanks for having me here.
Then let's all say thanks and call it a day, or at least I call it a day. For some of you, it's morning.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
I wish you, I don't know, whatever you celebrate in the next days, and Happy New Year. And we see us in January. And then I start. Thanks, Varun, and have a nice day. Bye, everyone.
See you.
Thanks, Kai. Thanks, Varun. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for everything.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Bonnie. Bye.